Ashley knew her first day at a new school would be tough, but she never imagined her teacher would try to humiliate her in front of everyone, smearing white paint on her hands. The stares from her classmates burned, but suddenly the door swung open, and a black woman stepped in. Her presence, so commanding, the air in the room seemed to freeze. Her calm yet piercing gaze made everyone stop in their tracks. No one knew who she was, but one thing was clear. Someone had just made a massive mistake. First days suck, don't they? You're walking into a room full of strangers, all of them sizing you up, judging you, and waiting to see if you're worth their attention. For Ashlyn James, 12 years old and brand new to this suburban middle school, it was a little worse than your typical awkward introductions. Being the only black girl in the entire grade? Yeah, that adds a whole new level of what the hell did I just walk into? She walked into the English class, clutching her books and trying not to look as nervous as she felt. The teacher, Mrs. Tracy Harper, older, gray-haired and looking like she'd rather be anywhere else, stopped mid-sentence as soon as she spotted Ashlyn. Her smile was so forced it practically creaked. "Well, well," Harper said, her voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. "A new student, everyone, please welcome. Let me check. Ashlyn James. Did I say that right?" "Yes, ma'am," Ashlyn replied, her voice steady despite the dozen pairs of eyes burning holes into her. "Good. And where are you from, Ashlyn?" Harper continued, her tone making it sound more like an interrogation than small talk. We just moved here, from downtown," Ashlyn answered, shifting on her feet. "Downtown?" Harper repeated, arching an eyebrow. "Well, let's hope you can keep up. We have pretty high standards here." The room went so quiet you could hear someone drop their pencil. Ashlyn stared back at her, her posture stiff but unbroken. A few kids exchanged uneasy glances, clearly catching the not-so-subtle jab. "I'll do just fine, ma'am," Ashlyn said firmly, sliding into an empty desk. Harper's smile turned sharp, like she was trying to hide her annoyance but failing miserably. "We'll see." Class went on, with Harper droning about themes and metaphors like she was auditioning for the most boring teacher award. Ashlyn kept her head down, scribbling notes, but it wasn't long before Harper called her out. "Miss James," Harper said, her voice cutting through the room like a whip, "what's the central theme of this passage?" Ashlyn glanced at the text and answered confidently, "It's about resilience, how the character overcomes obstacles despite everything being against her." A few students nodded. It was a solid answer, but Harper wasn't having it. "Resilience," Harper repeated, her tone as sharp as glass. "Interesting. But next time, wait until you're asked to speak. Interrupting isn't something we tolerate here." Ashlyn blinked, confused. "You asked me the question." Harper's eyes narrowed. "And I didn't give you permission to speak, do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Ashlyn said, her voice calm but icy. The tension in the room was so thick you could have sliced it with a butter knife. By the time the clock ticked toward the end of class, Harper looked like she was stewing. And then, just as the bell was about to ring, she pulled the most unhinged move anyone could have imagined. "You know," Harper said, reaching for a jar of white paint on the supply shelf, "since you're so keen to stand out, let's make it official." Ashlyn froze as Harper approached her desk with the jar. The other students stared, some whispering, some recording on their phones. Harper didn't care. She dipped her fingers into the paint and, with a smug grin, smeared it across Ashlyn's hands. "There," Harper said, stepping back like she'd just won a prize. "Now you'll fit right in." The room erupted in shocked gasps. Ashlyn stared at her paint-covered hands, her jaw tightening. She didn't yell, didn't cry. Instead, she looked Harper dead in the eye and said, "You're a teacher. Act like it." For a split second, Harper's confidence wavered. But she quickly recovered, crossing her arms. "Watch your mouth, young lady, or maybe your mother needs a lesson too." And that's when the door swung open. The door slammed open with a force that made everyone jump. In walked a woman who looked like she owned the place, sharp gray suit, polished heels, and a gaze that could freeze water. Sarah James, Ashlyn's mother and the most respected judge in the state, didn't need to raise her voice. Her mere presence was enough to silence the room. "And what exactly is going on here?" she asked, her tone calm but razor-sharp. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on her daughter. Ashlyn, still at her desk, had white paint smeared all over her hands. Mrs. Harper turned slowly, the jar of paint still in her hand. Her expression shifted from smug to startled in half a second. "Excuse me, this is my classroom," Harper snapped, clearly irritated by the interruption. "And you are?" Sarah stepped forward, her heels clicking against the tile. "I'm Sarah James," she said evenly, "Ashlyn's mother. And I'd like to know why my daughter is sitting here, humiliated, with paint on her hands." Mrs. Harper hesitated, her face flushing, but her arrogance didn't waver. "Your daughter," she said with exaggerated patience, "was being disrespectful. She spoke out of turn and needed to learn a lesson." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "So your idea of discipline involves smearing paint on a child in front of her classmates?" Harper faltered, but then straightened her back. "Sometimes students need to learn boundaries. It's not personal." "Not personal?" Sarah's tone sharpened. "You publicly humiliate a child, degrade her, and claim it's not personal? Let me make something clear, Mrs. Harper. This is very personal." The classroom was so silent you could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing. Several students discreetly raised their phones, recording every second. One girl whispered, "This is going to blow up online." Mrs. Harper tried to recover, stammering, I was maintaining classroom order." "Classroom order?" Sarah repeated, her voice icy. "You mean abusing your position of power to demean a child?" Before Harper could respond, the door opened again. This time it was Principal Brown. He stopped short as his eyes took in the scene. Sarah James, the furious judge, Ashlyn, sitting with paint-streaked hands, and Mrs. Harper looking guilty as sin. "Judge James," Brown stammered, his face pale. I wasn't expecting—" Sarah turned to him, her gaze piercing. "Clearly. If you were, perhaps you'd have done something about the behavior of your staff. Mr. Brown, I suggest we move this conversation to your office." "Of course," he said quickly, nodding. "Right this way." Sarah glanced back at Ashlyn, her expression softening for a moment. "Sweetheart, stay here. This will be handled." As Sarah left with the principal, the classroom erupted into whispers. Harper stood frozen at the front of the room, her confidence evaporating. Meanwhile, Ashlyn leaned back in her chair, wiping her hands with a tissue and muttering, "First day and I'm already a headline." Principal Brown's office was thick with tension, the kind that makes even the walls seem like they're holding their breath. Sarah James sat across from the desk, her back straight and her eyes locked on Brown. Next to him stood Mrs. Harper, clutching her purse like it could save her. Her earlier bravado had all but evaporated. "This is unacceptable," Sarah began, her tone like a blade. "Your teacher humiliated my daughter in front of an entire class. That's not discipline, it's abuse." Brown shifted nervously, his hands fidgeting on the desk. "Judge James, I understand your concern, and I assure you this isn't reflective of our school's values." "Your values asterisk?" Sarah's voice cut through his excuse. "Your values allowed one of your staff members to smear paint on a child. How is that not reflective of your school?" Mrs. Harper, pale but defiant, interrupted. "I was maintaining order. Your daughter spoke in class? That's her crime?" Sarah shot back, her voice sharp. "And you thought paint was the solution? Explain that to me." Harper stammered, but Sarah wasn't done. "You're supposed to educate, not humiliate. But since you clearly don't understand your role, I'll explain the consequences." Brown quickly interjected, his voice cracking. "Judge James, please, we'll handle this internally. Mrs. Harper will face disciplinary action." "That's a start," Sarah replied, her tone firm. "But it's not enough. I want a public apology issued to my daughter, and I want assurances that this school will implement diversity and sensitivity training immediately." Brown nodded rapidly. "Of course, we'll arrange that right away." "And Mrs. Harper?" Sarah turned her gaze on the teacher, who looked like she wanted to disappear. Brown hesitated, then sighed. "Effective immediately. Mrs. Harper is relieved of her teaching duties." Harper gasped. "You can't—" "You did this to yourself," Sarah interrupted, her tone ice cold. "Actions have consequences, Mrs. Harper. Perhaps this will be the lesson you clearly need." Harper's shoulders slumped as the reality set in. Sarah stood, adjusting her suit jacket. "Mr. Brown, I'll expect updates on the steps you're taking to ensure this doesn't happen again." If I don't see progress, this goes to the school board, understood? Yes, ma'am, Brown said quickly, nodding like his life depended on it. Back in the classroom, Ashlyn sat quietly as her classmates whispered around her. Phones buzzed with notifications, videos of the incident were already blowing up online. A girl leaned over and whispered, "Your mom is a total badass." The door opened, and Sarah walked in. Her expression softened as she saw Ashlyn still sitting with paint-streaked hands. She knelt beside her daughter. "It's done," Sarah said gently. "She's gone." Ashlyn managed a small smile. "Thanks, Mom." Sarah stood and addressed the class. "No one deserves to be treated the way my daughter was today. I want you all to know, if you ever face something like this, you stand up for yourself just like Ashlyn did." The students clapped, some nodding in agreement. A boy muttered, "She's amazing." In the following weeks, the school underwent major changes. Diversity training became mandatory for all staff. The principal issued a public apology, and Mrs. Harper's termination sent a clear message. As for Ashlyn, she became a symbol of strength and resilience, not just at her school but beyond. And Sarah, she proved once again why she was more than a judge. She was a force for justice. Together, they had turned a moment of humiliation into a lesson for everyone about standing tall in the face of injustice. Justice, after all, wasn't just served, it was a lesson no one would forget.